There is a chilling thought that unsettles even seasoned investigators. What if the person who ends your life doesn't know you and never needed to? Israel Keyes didn't stalk his victims online. He didn't follow a type. He didn't kill out of rage, jealousy, or revenge. He killed because he wanted to, between 2001 and 2012, across vast stretches of the United States. People vanished without warning. No witnesses. No clear suspects. No obvious patterns. Just empty homes, abandoned cars, and families left clinging to unanswered questions. For years, these disappearances seemed unrelated, tragic, isolated mysteries scattered across a country too large to connect the dots. Behind them moved a quiet man who blended in effortlessly. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Utah and raised in a deeply religious, isolated household. On the surface, he grew into what many would consider ordinary: a construction worker, a handyman, a boyfriend, a father. He served in the U.S. Army, lived in Alaska, paid his bills, and smiled at neighbors. No explosive temper. No criminal record that hinted at the scale of violence to come. But behind that normal exterior was a man living a second life built on secrecy, planning, and control. Unlike most serial killers, Keyes did not hunt impulsively. He treated murder like a long-term project. He traveled thousands of miles simply to kill someone he had never seen before. He studied geography, police procedures, and human behavior. He believed that randomness was his greatest protection. And for years, it worked. The FBI has officially confirmed 3 murders, but they believe the true number may be 11 or more. Some investigators fear it could be higher. The terrifying part is this: many of his victims may never be identified because Keyes deliberately erased them from existence. No bodies, no names, no closure. This story is not just about a killer. It's about the people whose lives were cut short without warning. People who woke up on ordinary mornings, unaware they would never return home. It's about families who waited for phone calls that never came. And it's about a man who proved that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look exactly like everyone else. Israel Keyes did not rush violence. He prepared for it. Long before a victim ever crossed his path, Keyes had already been there, digging into the earth, sealing containers, and walking away as if nothing unusual had happened. Hidden beneath soil, snow, and forest debris were what investigators later called kill kits. They were silent promises of future violence, buried months or even years in advance. Inside these caches were items chosen with cold precision: guns, ammunition, restraints, silencers, zip ties, tools for disposal. Nothing impulsive, nothing forgotten. Each kit was placed in a remote location: deep woods, rural backroads, isolated parks. Places where screams would dissolve into nothing and no one would stumble upon a crime in progress. This was not chaos. This was strategy. Keyes believed that preparation was the difference between getting away with murder and becoming just another name in a police file. He traveled thousands of miles specifically to separate himself from his crimes. He would fly into one state, rent a car under his own name, because he knew law enforcement wouldn't expect a killer to be so bold, then drive for days to another location entirely. He paid in cash. He disabled phones or removed batteries. He avoided cameras long before most criminals understood their reach. Most chilling of all was his approach to victims. Israel Keyes did not fantasize about specific people. There was no emotional fixation, no obsession, no personal grievance. Victims were selected based on opportunity: a couple alone, a person working late, a house with poor lighting, a stretch of road with no traffic. To him, they were not individuals with histories, families, or futures. They were variables in a calculation he had already solved. Psychologists later noted that this randomness was not accidental. It was deliberate. By avoiding a victim profile, Keyes ensured that patterns would never emerge. No age range, no gender preference, no geographic consistency. This made him nearly invisible to law enforcement for over a decade. Yet beneath this meticulous planning was something far darker. Keyes described his urges as uncontrollable but managed. He compared them to pressure building over time, something that had to be released. Planning became a way to justify the violence, to convince himself that he was in control rather than enslaved by impulse. And disturbingly, he took pride in it. He believed he was smarter than investigators, smarter than other killers who were caught because they rushed, bragged, or grew careless. Each successful crime reinforced his belief that he was untouchable, that his system worked, but systems fail. And the very discipline that allowed Israel Keyes to operate undetected for years would eventually unravel, not because of a mistake or crime scene, but because of something far more human: arrogance, overconfidence, and the belief that he could always stay one step ahead. At this point in his life, no one knew his name. No one suspected the quiet man passing through airports and highways. But his violence had already begun. By the time Israel Keyes admitted to his earliest crimes, there was no emotion in his voice, no hesitation, no remorse. He spoke the way someone might describe a long drive or a completed task. What he revealed would haunt investigators, not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed about how early his violence began and how long he had lived with it hidden inside him. According to Keyes' own statements to the FBI, his first known violent crime occurred before anyone was looking for him, before his name meant anything at all. In the late 1990s, near a remote river in Oregon, Israel Keyes saw a teenage girl alone. There was no build-up, no stalking over days, just a sudden decision, an opportunity presenting itself exactly the way he liked it. He abducted her. The details he later provided were disturbing in their clarity. He restrained her, sexually assaulted her, and left her alive, not out of mercy, but because at that point he believed he could still control his urges. That crime, he said, unlocked something inside him. It proved that he could dominate another human being and walk away without consequence. No report led back to him, and no suspect sketch circulated, and no knock ever came at his door. That silence reinforced a dangerous belief. He could get away with it. Shortly after, Keyes joined the U.S. Army, serving from 1998 to 2001. To outsiders, this appeared to be a stabilizing period. Structure, discipline, purpose. But internally, the violence did not disappear. It went dormant, buried under routine and authority, only to resurface later with greater intensity. When his military service ended, the restraint ended with it. Keyes later told investigators that it was after this point, in the early 2000s, that he began killing. He refused to give names. He refused to give locations precise enough to recover bodies. What he did confirmed chilled investigators to their core. There were victims whose families would never get answers. He described murders committed far from where he lived. Victims taken quickly, killed swiftly, and disposed of in ways designed to erase them completely. In some cases, he said, the bodies were left where nature would do the work: animals, water, time. For law enforcement, this created a nightmare scenario. There were no missing persons reports that obviously fit, no forensic evidence, no known crime scenes. Just a man claiming to have taken lives in places investigators couldn't even confirm he had been. Psychologists listening to these confessions noted something deeply unsettling. Keyes did not describe rage. He described process. Each act of violence seemed to refine his method, teaching him what worked and what didn't. The early crimes were not mistakes. They were rehearsals. And with every successful disappearance, his confidence grew. He learned that people assume patterns, that police departments don't easily share information across states, that if you kill someone far from home, no one connects you to the crime. These lessons became the foundation for everything that followed. By the time Israel Keyes moved to Alaska, built a life, and started a family, the transformation was complete. The man who once tested boundaries had crossed them fully. Killing was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability he carefully scheduled around everyday life. No one around him suspected that while he worked construction jobs and attended family gatherings, he was also carrying the weight of secrets buried in forests and fields across the country. And it was only a matter of time before one of those buried crimes would surface. Not through chance, but through a mistake that would lead investigators directly to one of his most horrifying acts. In June 2011, the town of Essex, Vermont, was quiet in the way small towns usually are. Familiar routines, unlocked doors, neighbors who wave without thinking twice. Bill and Lorraine Currier had lived there for years. They were known as a private, ordinary couple. No enemies, No dangerous associations. Nothing that would ever suggest they were about to become targets. But to Israel Keyes, that was exactly the point. He had already chosen Vermont long before he arrived. He had already buried a kill kit nearby years earlier, proof that this crime was never spontaneous. When the moment came, he boarded a plane in Alaska, flew to Chicago, rented a car, and drove nearly 1,000 miles through unfamiliar territory, all to reach a place where no one knew him and no one would recognize his face. On the night he struck, the KEYES were asleep in their home. Keyes broke in silently. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Armed and in control, he woke the couple and restrained them inside their own bedroom, the space where they should have been safest. There was no argument, no warning, no chance to understand what was happening. A stranger stood over them, already committed to what he had planned years earlier. Keyes forced Bill and Lorraine out of their home and into their own vehicle. They were driven through darkness, away from the familiar streets of their town, toward an abandoned farmhouse miles away. Every passing minute pushed them further from help, further from survival. At the farmhouse, the violence escalated. According to Keyes' later confession, Bill Currier attempted to fight back. The attempt cost him his life. Lorraine was left alone with a man who had never intended to let either of them live. The killings were swift, controlled, and final, carried out not in rage, but with cold intention. When it was over, Israel Keyes did not linger. He disposed of evidence, abandoned the farmhouse, and drove away as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. By the time the KEYES were reported missing, Keyes was already gone, thousands of miles away, returning to a life that appeared completely normal. For investigators, the case was baffling. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry that clearly explained what had happened. The couple had simply vanished. Their car was missing. Their home looked frozen in time. Everyday items left behind. No note, no explanation. It would be months later, after Keyes was in custody for an entirely different crime, that the truth emerged. Even then, he refused to provide full closure. Despite leading the FBI to buried weapons used in crime, he never revealed where the Keyes bodies were taken. To this day, Bill and Lorraine Currier have never been found. The impact on the community was devastating. A town that believed in safety and familiarity was forced to accept a terrifying reality. A stranger could arrive from across the country, commit unimaginable violence, and disappear without a trace. For the FBI, the Currier murders confirmed their worst fear. Israel Keyes was not a localized threat. He was not bound by geography, and he was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But even after this brutal crime, Keyes believed the system still worked. He believed he was invisible, and that belief would lead him to make one final catastrophic decision, a decision involving a young woman in Alaska, and a crime that would finally expose everything he had tried so desperately to hide. By early 2012, Israel Keyes believed he had perfected his system. He had killed across state lines, he had erased bodies, and he had walked away every time. What he didn't realize was that control, the very thing he prized most, was beginning to slip. On the evening of February 1st, 2012, in Anchorage, Alaska, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working alone at a small roadside coffee stand. She was young, friendly, and saving money for her future. Like so many people at that age, her life was just beginning. Plans, relationships, and possibilities stretching far ahead of her. She never saw him coming. Israel Keyes approached the stand wearing a ski mask. He pulled out a gun. In seconds, Samantha was forced out of her workplace and into his truck. Surveillance footage would later show her being led away, alive, frightened, and completely unaware that she would never return. Keyes drove her to his home. What followed was calculated cruelty. Samantha was restrained, assaulted, and ultimately murdered by strangulation. Her death was not impulsive. It was controlled, deliberate, and devastating. But what made this crime different, fatally different for Keyes, was what he did next. Instead of disappearing, he stayed. Keyes left Samantha's body inside a shed outside his home and flew out of state on a cruise with his girlfriend, behaving as though nothing had happened. When he returned, he staged a horrifying ransom plot. He sewed Samantha's eyes open, applied makeup, and posed her body to make it appear she was still alive. He took a photograph and sent it to her family along with a ransom demand. For Samantha's parents, the hope was unbearable. They believed she might still be alive, suffering but alive, and they followed every instruction, desperate to bring their daughter home. But Samantha had already been dead. KEYES withdrew money from her bank account using her debit card, traveling across the country as he did so. He believed this movement would confuse investigators. Instead, it created a digital trail, one he could not erase. ATM cameras captured his image. Timestamps narrowed his location. Patterns emerged. For the first time in over a decade, Israel KEYES had left behind something he could not bury. When Samantha's body was eventually discovered in a frozen lake north of Anchorage, the reality crushed everyone who had clung to hope. The brutality of what she endured, combined with calculated deception of the ransom scheme, sent shockwaves through the community. Anchorage was no longer safe in the way people believed it was. Friends mourned a young woman whose life had been stolen in the most senseless way imaginable. Her family faced a grief compounded by the knowledge that they had been unknowingly negotiating with her killer while she was already gone. And for law enforcement, the case marked a turning point. Israel KEYES had crossed a line, not just morally but strategically. The anonymity he relied on was gone. The randomness he trusted had failed him. He was still free, but the clock was now ticking. On March 13, 2012, in Lufkin, Texas, a state trooper noticed a vehicle that matched the description tied to the ATM withdrawals. Inside was a man who appeared calm, cooperative, unremarkable. Israel KEYES did not resist. He did not run. He did not panic. He had been stopped before in his life. He believed he could talk his way through this too. But when law enforcement searched the vehicle, the illusion collapsed. Inside were Samantha Koenig's driver's license, her cell phone, and large amounts of cash. There was no plausible explanation, no innocent story. The evidence was immediate and devastating. Israel KEYES was arrested. Back in custody, he was transported to Anchorage. What followed were some of the most unsettling interrogation sessions FBI agents had ever experienced. KEYES was not defensive. He was not emotional. He was selective. He spoke when it suited him. He stopped when questions got too close. He negotiated information like currency. He admitted to killing Samantha Koenig. Then, slowly, he began to hint at more. Murders in other states. Kill kits buried years earlier. Crimes that had never been connected and might never be fully uncovered. Investigators realized they were dealing with something far larger than a single case. KEYES described traveling thousands of miles just to kill, then returning home to resume normal life. He explained how he avoided detection, how he studied police procedures, how he exploited jurisdictional gaps. He showed no visible remorse of the victims, only frustration at having been caught. Psychological experts observed a man driven by control and secrecy. Talking gave him power. Silence gave him power, too. Every detail he withheld reminded investigators that some families might never know the truth. As the investigation expanded, the weight of what he had done began to settle over the country. Detectives reopened cold cases. Families revisited old grief. Communities questioned how many disappearances might now carry a shadow. But just as law enforcement began closing in on the full scope of his crimes, Israel KEYES made one final decision, one that would ensure many answers would die with him. On December 1st, 2012, guards found him dead in his cell. He had slashed his wrists and then strangled himself using a bedsheet, ensuring there would be no chance of rescue. Beneath his body, written in blood, was a disturbing message, along with drawings of skulls, symbols that reflected not remorse but fixation. For investigators, it was a devastating loss. With his death, timelines went cold. Confessions ended mid-sentence. Maps of potential burial sites remained unfinished. Families who might have one day learned what happened to their loved ones were left instead with permanent uncertainty. The FBI publicly stated what many already feared. Israel KEYES likely killed more people than will ever be confirmed. His deliberate use of randomness, long-distance travel, and body disposal meant that some victims may never be identified. Their disappearances lost among thousands of unsolved cases across the country. Communities struggled to process the reality that such violence had moved silently through their lives. Friends and neighbors of Keyes were left questioning how someone so unremarkable could harbor such darkness. Families of victims carried a unique burden: grief without full answers, loss without closure. And then there's the larger, more unsettling question. How many times did Israel Keyes stand in line at an airport next to families heading on vacation? How many times did he pass strangers on highways, already knowing someone would not survive the night? How many kill kits still lie buried, undiscovered, their intended victims unknown? Israel Keyes did not leave behind a manifesto explaining himself. He offered no apology to the families he shattered. What he left instead was silence, intentional, calculated silence, forcing the world to confront a truth that is deeply uncomfortable. Some monsters don't want to be understood. They don't want to be remembered. They want to disappear, taking their secrets with them. And perhaps that is the most chilling part of all. Because long after Israel Keyes was gone, his shadow remained, stretched across forests, highways, and unsolved cases, reminding us that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, plans patiently, and vanishes without leaving a name behind. If this story disturbed you, challenged you, or raised questions you can't stop thinking about, share your thoughts below. What do you believe remains hidden in this case? How many victims do you think were never found? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that refuse to stay buried. Because some truths don't end when the killer does.